Vice President. Mr. Vice President, there can be no prosperity without safety and security. And I thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this, my fourth budget debate, 2023-2024, piloted by the Honourable Minister of Finance. And let me say from the onset, once again, listening to this budget, I got another dose of deja vu, Mr. President. You see, the Minister continues to repeat many promises, programs, and projects that have either failed to deliver in the past or they come under new names today, Mr. President. We see many initiatives that have been poorly executed by this government, those that have been completed at least. But, Mr. President, let me take the opportunity at this juncture to congratulate the Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Kamala Prasad-Bissessar, the Leader of the Opposition, for her response to this farce of a budget, Mr. President. The Leader of the Opposition clinically dissected, dismantled, unveiled and debunked the macroeconomic numbers, exposed the broken promises, as well as the overall mamagai by this Minister of Finance, which he attempted to deliver to an already beleaguered nation. Mr. President, I also congratulate my colleague, Senator Mark, who did well, and our new senator who joined us, who did well in exposing this government that is without a plan, without a vision, and without any mission. Mr. President, the title of this budget presentation is Building Capacity for Diversification and Growth. And what a crisis we are in, that after 8 years, this government is only now speaking about diversification and growth, Mr. President. Mr. President, the numbers will show you that rather than growth, this government has provided decline. And rather than diversification, they have managed over multi-sector decimation. You see, Mr. President, the Minister of Finance is an expert of playing with numbers, manipulating numbers, and using flowery language to try to hoodwink the population. But, Mr. President, the numbers simply don't lie. When we look at real GDP, and not nominal GDP as the Honourable Minister of Finance likes to use, we see in 2015 under a UNC government, where real GDP stood at 187.5 billion, and 7 years later, at the end of 2022, we see real GDP decline to 150.3 billion, which represents a PNM decline of $37 billion. Mr. President, Vice President, point blank, this government has declined the economy by 20%, Mr. President. And while declining this economy, Mr. President, we see a PNM government increase our public debt to a staggering $129 billion. This represents over 50 billion added to the debt since the UNC left office in 2015. And Mr. President, Vice President, we see a debt to GDP ratio of 70.9% and climbing, whereas compared to the UNC, when they demitted office, we were at 44.1%. This is more than a 60% increase in our debt to GDP under this PNM regime, Mr. President. And one of the greatest stunts deployed so far is the way in which the Honourable Minister of Finance plays bookkeeper regarding the national deficit. Mr. President, the Minister in his budget statement indicated that in the financial year 2022-2023, this government achieved a surplus of some 0.6%, which he can say thank God for a war in Ukraine, and then comes in this budget indicating a deficit of $5.16 billion. However, Mr. Vice President, we know that the government owed some $7.8 billion in VAT refunds. We know that there have been monies owing to contractors piling up in the billions over the last 8 years that have not been paid by this government. And Mr. President, we saw recently in the Standing Finance Committee in the other place, where the Minister of Finance held back monies from various critical ministries, such as national security, Mr. President. And added to that, excluding capital loan principal repayments of more than to the tune of $6 billion. So I put it to you, Mr. President, if the government would have paid out those pertinent figures owed some by law, there would have been no surplus in 2023. And in fact, we would see a deficit being presented today of more than $13 billion, Mr. President. So this government has held back on debt payments and disbursements all in an effort to limit the expenditure so that they could mama-guide this population with a low deficit, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Minister of Finance is running from the reality of overall manufacturing collapse, opting to cherry-pick non-energy sector manufacturing. Again, the numbers do not lie. Real manufacturing sector GDP has fallen from 30.32 billion to 25.86 billion between 2015 when the UNC left office and today in 2022 under a PNM government. This represents a decline of 14.9% in this period under this PNM. And then we hear the Minister of Finance boasting about non-energy exports. But let me tell you the reality of it. In 2015, it totaled $2.64 billion when the UNC left office. And then the latest central bank figures tell us, and the Minister of Finance confirmed it today, that it stands at just $2.38 billion as of 2022. That, Mr. President, is a decline of 1.7 billion TT dollars, or US 260 million of foreign exchange not coming into our shores anymore. And we wonder how we are in this Forex crisis today, Mr. President. And adding to this crisis, we see another 1.5 billion US dollars in foreign direct investment exiting our shores. However, Mr. President, Vice President, don't be alarmed. It will take a united National Congress government to reverse this economy and put it back into stability and growth, Mr. President. So Vice President, how has the PNM government attempted to fill this gap and mitigate the losses created by this PNM mismanagement? Not by diversifying the economy, not by fixing manufacturing, Mr. President, not by cutting the phantom billion-dollar projects that breed corruption and facilitate wanton wastage under this government. No, Mr. President. The government believes that they could come and tax the citizens of our nation out of this PNM crisis.
Shame.
You see, this government has been a serial taxer, increasing VAT on 7,000 food items, increasing green fund levy, business levy, and we even see a tire tax under this government, Mr. President. Nothing escapes. But, Mr. President, we see a minister signaling that he's coming to the citizens of this nation with the dreaded property tax. And then this Minister of Finance has the gall in the other place to stand up and say he's bringing no new tax under his government. So what do you call this property tax, Mr. President? What is this? What on earth is this? Mr. President, you see, we have grown accustomed to so many untruths by this government. We had to hear Conrad Enel talk about there being no foreign exchange crisis. We had to hear a Prime Minister tell us that he was not shutting down Petrotrain, and boom, the fridge door closed and Petrotrain shut down.
And his suit was in
and then we had to hear a Minister of Public Utilities tell us that they would not be raising electricity after the local government election. And Mr. President, yesterday the entire country woke up to see electricity prices going up in double digits, Mr. President. And let me tell through you, Mr. Vice President, to my colleague, Senator Lawrence Hislop, in the papers today, it is the head of the Tobago Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Martin George, who said it point blank, and I quote, "A damn vex." This was in the Newsday today, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, they have plunged this nation into pain and darkness by what they have done by betraying the citizens of this country. Mr. President, so the Minister of Finance has indicated that property tax on residential properties will be collected this year. Mr. President, while listening in this debate, I kept hearing the minister regurgitate residential. So it is only residential property pockets all you're coming after? Mr. President, I remember standing in this chamber last year and the year before that, asking the Minister of Finance whether or not they intend to bring property tax to the commercial and industrial properties, Mr. President. And I'm forced to ask this question: does the government intend to only impose this property tax on residential customers and put it on the shoulders of an already beleaguered and financially compromised population? Does the Minister of Finance have any intention to tax commercial and industrial many of them sitting in the hands of the wealthy in this nation. Could the Minister of Finance come clean and tell us, even if the assessment has started on the commercial and industrial properties, so that he could eventually tax them? You see, I ask this on behalf of the citizens of our country, because these citizens want equity, Mr. Vice President. These citizens want justice, Mr. Vice President. You cannot continue taxing citizens while big business gets away scot-free. You see, it is critical for the people of this country to know, Mr. President, because dotted through all 14 regional corporations through the length and breadth of this country, there are commercial and industrial properties that sit right there next to residential properties, sometimes next door to residential properties. And these commercial properties deplete the infrastructure of the environment in which they exist. Many of them add towards the pollution in the environment. They too, Mr. Vice President, require the goods and services from the regional corporations that the citizens of this country require as well. So, Mr. President, so why unfairly tax an already struggling citizenry while the big boys get a bly? You see, Mr. President, the question is, why is the government not taxing industrial and commercial properties? Is there more any mortar than any pestle? Is this yet another example of the elitist nature of this PNM government, where the Prime Minister says the rich will get richer while the poor will benefit? But where is the poor benefiting today, Mr. President? The poor have been abandoned in this country. But fear not, Mr. Vice President. When the United National Congress returns to government, we will scrap this property tax, Mr. President. Mr. President, Vice President, there is more to this property tax that the government is letting on to, and once again, which also brings an assault on our democracy. I direct you to 2022, to the debate on local government reform bill, where the government had indicated there and again in this budget debate today that all proceeds of property tax from residential properties would go to all 14 regional corporations. All right, that's fair. However, Mr. President, it was at the end of that bill that I picked up the mischief in that bill. You see, if you pay close attention, you will see a startling revelation, Mr. Vice President. See in clause 10 of the bill regarding the implementation of property tax on commercial and industrial properties, the bill states, and I quote, clause 10 of the bill would seek to amend the Property Tax Act, Chapter 7604. New subsection 3 would provide that the Minister of Finance may, by order, declare if agriculture, industrial, or commercial taxes may be collected by the municipal corporation and what percentage may be retained. And in this case, Mr. President, retained in a consolidated fund. By this legislation, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance, a politician, a member of the executive arm of the state, can decide at his whim and fancy how much, what percentage of that property tax remains with the corporation and what percentage goes into the consolidated fund. So, Mr. President, Vice President, this opens up the door for the potential of political victimization. Any Minister of Finance, I cast no aspersions, can decide to put only 20% of the tax collected on commercial properties to a UNC-held corporation, or he could decide to put 80% of that property tax to a PNM-held corporation, maybe one that they might be losing soon enough, like the San Fernando City Corporation. Almost got that. But, Mr. President, we continue, Vice President, we continue to see the overreach of this Minister of Finance and his colleagues throughout all the legislation passed under this governance. And yet, another example of this overreach by this Minister of Finance is seen in the legislation passed for the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority. Of course, I heard the Minister of Finance mention it in his budget statement. But what the government, PNM government, insists on is an interpretation of the TTRA, where the Minister of Finance has full power to appoint the chairman and the board of directors of this critical agency, an agency that should remain completely independent of politicians. The Minister of Finance's appointed board can then appoint the most senior position, which is the Director General. And additionally, this Director General can hire all the workers under them on contract. Therefore, there is no security of tenure, Mr. Vice President. Workers are always under threat of not having their contracts renewed. So, Mr. Vice President, what this means is that if any Minister of Finance decides to invade the privacy of any citizen or victimize any opposing politician in this country, he can access their information through the threat of job tenure to the staff of the TTRA, including the Director General and the Board of Directors. And let me remind you, Mr. President, this agency is responsible for collecting more than 90% of our tax revenues in this country, Mr. President. So it is completely dangerous and reckless to have any politician brandishing this level of power.
Correct.
And Mr. President, contrary to what the PNM will tell you, we are not against the TTRA. We simply don't agree with the draconian model where this minister has such sweeping powers. But Mr. President, it's okay. We will continue to challenge this government to remove these sweeping powers from the Minister of Finance. And I repeat again, when the United National Congress gets back into power, we will scrap the property tax, Mr. President. Mr. Vice President, manufacturing is an area that the government uses to most mamagai and hoodwink the country. Both the Minister of Finance and the Honourable Minister of Trade and Industry in the other place came back with a song and dance about non-energy manufacturing, ignoring the decline in total manufacturing and exports in this country. As I indicated earlier, the GDP of manufacturing per the central bank has declined by 14.9% from when the UNC left office. And the reality is that the cherry-picked figures used by this Minister of Finance cannot withstand the realities of the day. We see the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Trade and Industry once more come to this Parliament, as they have done in previous years, with a number of pie-in-the-sky initiatives, programs and projects, claiming that these initiatives will help diversify the economy and would be the saving grace for manufacturers and businesses in general, and would help to bring prosperity to the SMEs in particular. But Mr. President, this shows that the Minister of Finance and the Honourable Minister of Trade is completely out of touch with the realities of the issues that impact manufacturers and businesses in this country today.
Out of touch.
See, Mr. President, every business in this country can attest today that it to be more difficult than ever not only to grow a business in this declining economy, but simply to survive in this environment. Mr. Vice President, I am a businessman. And when I look across on this side, with the exception of maybe one senator on that side, none of them have any business of noteworthiness. None of them understand how to run a business, Mr. President. And none of them even understand what are the issues of running a business in this country today, Mr. President. They don't know how to navigate through the worsening ease of doing business in this country that we have ever seen in our history. Mr. President, and yet this government boasts about non-energy manufacturing increasing. Yes. But this is not as a result of any initiative or any fertile ground laid by this PNM government, Mr. President. The growth in the non-energy sector that we see today is based on the tenacity and the struggles of the private sector businessman and woman in this country who continue to struggle to grow in this declining economy, Mr. President. I'll get to that. These businesses increase their exports in order. Let me tell you why they're increasing exports, Mr. Vice President. They're increasing exports to supplement the PNM-induced shortfall in foreign exchange and navigate through the worst and most crippling ease of doing business ever, Mr. President. So the PNM must take no credit for the growth that we see today. They must hang their heads in shame, Mr. President. They must hang their heads in shame. But, Mr. President, let me tell you the facts here now. And the World Bank measured the ease of doing business back in 2015 when the UNC was in power. Trinidad and Tobago placed 67th in the world. And just a couple years ago, under this PNM administration, we declined to 105 in the world, Mr. President, Vice President. Now it is a complete shame that the World Bank has stopped doing this reading, because undoubtedly, if they continue to do it, we will see this government decline even further in ease of doing business. Probably even to 115th or 120th in the world. And no amount of trade missions to Chile, discussed by the Honorable Minister of Trade is going to fix that ease of doing business, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the four major areas that have been the most detrimental as it pertains to the ease of doing business, the four areas that keep coming up in our consultation with the various chambers, the manufacturing associations, and the wider civil society. You know what they are, Mr. President? Let me tell you what it is. And hopefully the Honorable Minister of Trade will listen up this year. Inefficiencies and delays in our national ports. Foreign exchange shortages, Mr. Vice President. Oppressive delays on VAT refunds, Mr. Vice President. And everything is troubled and destroyed by the scourge of crime in this country, Mr. Vice President. Those are the four areas that impact the ease of doing business that this government has failed to address.
Correct.
Mr. Vice President, the first major issue, as I said, plaguing the businesses in this country is the bureaucracy and inefficiencies at our nation's port. Imagine that in 2023, you still cannot pay your customs, excise and VAT online with credit cards and links today, Mr. Vice President. You still have to stand up in the bank to get a certified check. Or, Mr. Vice President, you have to compromise your cash flows by accommodating a drawdown system on the Assecuda. Mr. President, when illegal substances are found in any bonded warehouse, the entire bond is shut and shipments have to be redirected to another bond. This costs time and money to the importer. Why not simply put scanners in all bonded warehouses and in all ports in this country? What about the bureaucracy between agencies, Mr. Vice President? Customs and Excise and the Bureau of Standards use two different information systems. When Customs and Excise has to send information via the Assecuda system to the TT BizLink system used by the Bureau of Standards, it causes delays of up to 1 and 2 days, Mr. Vice President, for the Bureau of Standards to complete their process. This can cause importers to incur rent and demurrage. Additionally, we see understaffing and under-resourcing across the agencies, including Customs and Excise, Bureau of Standards, Food and Drug, furthering frustrating the process, Mr. President. And pray you don't have to bring anything into the Point Lisa port, because we understand today that every single container must be inspected manually. So I call on the government again to place scanners in all ports, including the Point Lisa's port, Mr. Vice President. Let us have every possible tool to catch all illegal entries and minimize the cost of time and money that manufacturers and businesses experience. Mr. President, and then the foreign exchange supply issue, which I'll speak of more in a moment, is causing further headaches at the port. Shipping companies no longer accept payment in TT dollars unless it is at premium price, and have forced importers to pay the shipping in US or face having your shipments held. Mr. President, this causes further delay to clear shipments, especially for the small, medium, and micro enterprises who have difficulty in getting US dollars to pay these charges, Mr. President. So these delays cause importers to have rent and demurrage, and what do you think happens then? This expense is passed on to the consumer, to the citizen, when food prices go up, when hardware prices go up, and other necessary items and important items. But I move on to foreign exchange, Mr. Vice President. The lack of foreign exchange has been an ongoing gripe of both the business community and ordinary citizens. We are seeing banks slash their credit card limits, but yet we see our Minister of Finance come here and blame it on online purchases by citizens. Blame business people for not repatriating their funds. Blame everyone except themselves, Mr. President. Because it is PNM who created this foreign exchange crisis, Mr. President. And they must accept that. They must pin it to their chest. The PNM crashed this economy, and as a result of that, they decimated foreign currency.
Correct.
Mr. Vice President, and let me remind you, over $3 billion in foreign reserves were wiped out by the hands of the PNM since the UNC left office. This crisis started with the PNM when they decided to close the fridge door and shut down Petrotrin. Petrotrin, Mr. Vice President, was a national asset that was earning more than $350 million per annum in foreign exchange. And between 2018 and now, the PNM has been unable to replace this foreign currency that they've lost. Additionally, Mr. Vice President, this government has mismanaged the gas supply, hurting downstreamers at the Point Lisas industrial estate, forcing them to use smaller plants or just leave TNT altogether. Just a week ago, just this week, in the Daily Express, dated October the 14th, in an article named Lack of Gas, we see Methanex announce the 2024 closure of the Atlas plant and the prioritization of a smaller Titan plant due to the scarce gas supply. We know for a fact, as I said earlier, that more than $1.5 billion exited our shores in recent times under this PNM government. Companies like ArcelorMittal, Lever Brothers, and 1/3 of the Point Lisas industrial estate packed up their bags and left for greener pastures, taking with them the billions of dollars in US dollars in revenue, as well as the thousands, amongst many other companies, taking away the thousands of jobs that they once created in this country. And I know the Honorable Mr. Trade, she's getting antsy here now. With her soft hands, she's getting antsy. But the Honorable Mr. Trade will come and want to speak about the Exim Bank. Now, we believe, let me let her know that, the Honorable Minister know that the Exim Bank is a good initiative. It is a good initiative. But according to the Minister of Finance, they have only provided foreign exchange for only 158 export manufacturers. And we know in this country that there are more than 400 manufacturers. So what has happened to the more than 250 manufacturers who are not getting this foreign exchange? Many of them who are SMEs in this country, Mr. President, because we know the big boys getting the money. Yeah. How many of them have been left in the cold, Mr. Vice President? And let me tell you why I know how many were left in the cold. Because I do my research, I go back to the debates. I remember the debates, Mr. Vice President. It was a private members' debate in March of 2022 that the Minister of Finance revealed to the Senate that as of February of this year, though 82% of companies that access Forex from the Exim Bank were SMEs, listen to this, only 28.7% of the total money provided by Exim Bank actually went to the SMEs. So, Mr. Vice President, while the big boys get the lion's share, more and more SMEs, small, medium, and micro enterprises are abandoned by this government. And then the Minister of Finance then boasts of increasing the ceiling on foreign exchange provided by the Exim Bank, yet conveniently omits to let us know what the ceiling is. Probably promises that never materialize, Mr. Vice President. But Mr. President, the main thing we found out, the United National Congress, we do our research, and we found out what created the most recent and worsening issue of foreign exchange in the past few months. And it wasn't online purchases, Mr. Vice President. This government has a history and a legacy of creating a problem, bringing the solution to the problem, and then wanting you to congratulate them for the solution, and then the solution never materializes. Mr. President, this time, the PNM government created a problem, which is the third issue I'm going to talk about, which is the non-repayment of VAT refunds. The mammoth problem, then attempted to solve it by worsening our foreign exchange problem. And it is because of the bravery of a now former independent senator who questioned the Minister of Finance mere months ago. I know she's not here with us today, right? Regarding the state of VAT refunds owing to manufacturers, the Minister of Finance admitted that as at March 2023, some $7.8 billion in VAT refunds were owed. This government has almost doubled the outstanding VAT refunds compared to 2015 when the UNC demitted office. This is a multi-billion-dollar interest-free loan taken by this government against the manufacturers of this country and on their backs, Mr. Vice President. And in response to the independent senator, the Minister of Finance, in his classic, knee-jerk reaction, announced that $3 billion would be paid via VAT bonds. An additional $1 to $2 billion would be paid back from the consolidated fund. That would have been done in the 2023 fiscal year, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, let me remind this House that VAT bonds is still a loan, Mr. Vice President. It shifts the debt from owing manufacturers to now owing the banks when these manufacturers go and cash their bonds in. And on top of that, the terms announced by the Honourable Minister of Finance were 3.15% interest per annum. So, Mr. Vice President, if the bonds were fully utilized as promised, it would cost the taxpayers of this country an additional $283 million in just interest payments to banks, Mr. Vice President.
So they're a mistake.
Yes, but before I go back to the foreign exchange, I have to ask the Honourable Minister of Finance today, how much of that $3 billion in bonds promised were actually issued? How much of the $1 to $2 billion from the consolidated fund was actually given as promise? And I would like to know how much today do the non-payment of VAT refunds stand at today? You see, Mr. Vice President, the Minister mentioned nothing about VAT refunds in his budget statement. 4 hours spent in the other place, and not one word about VAT refunds. Running from the realities of their neglect, when the Minister continues to stifle the liquidity of manufacturers in this country, stifle the growth, and in some cases bankrupt businesses, especially the small, medium, and micro businesses, by unethically holding back these VAT refunds. Mr. Vice President, I come back to the foreign exchange. So this mismanagement of the VAT refunds further amplified our foreign exchange crisis. How so, Mr. President? You see, we consulted with various banks and consulted with various persons of the energy sector. We have come to learn that these VAT refunds, a portion of them, having been paid out in the form of bonds in a panic by this government, a lot of it went to the energy manufacturers. This meant that these companies received a wash of TT dollars from these refunds. And given that these companies would normally have to convert their US dollar revenues in order for their companies to pay their local operational costs, now with this wash of money via TT bonds, there was no need for these companies to convert their foreign exchange. And as a result of that, we've seen in the last few months a complete nosedive in the foreign exchange supply in the domestic market. I'm a businessman, I see it, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, and who do you think this PNM mismanagement affects the most? It is the small, medium, and micro businesses that hurt the most. They are the ones standing in the lines in the bank waiting for hundreds of dollars when they need thousands of US dollars. And they are the ones that are now struggling to survive after Christmas. You see, Mr. President, for raw materials and finished goods to be paid for and shipped in order to arrive in time for Christmas sales, these items would have had to have been paid for and shipped in the months of July, August, September. And given that this exacerbated foreign exchange crisis would have occurred during these months, many of these SMEs, being unable to acquire the required foreign exchange, would have literally missed the boat and would have lost the opportunity to capitalize on this peak period of Christmas. And in the end, in January of next year, Mr. Vice President, many of these SMEs are going to pay the ultimate price, where they join the more than 6,000 SMEs that shut their doors under this PNM after the COVID pandemic, Mr. Vice President. And let me remind this Senate, it is the SMEs that are the lifeblood of this nation. They represent more than 32% of our GDP, while creating tens of thousands of jobs for thousands of families. Yet this PNM government has abandoned every single one of them. Mr. Vice President, it's going to take a United National Congress government to restore the dignity of these SMEs and to bring them back to their former glory. And Mr. President, we look at the single biggest issue impacting this country, business community, which is crime. We have seen not only crime impacting citizens.
Senator, you have 5 minutes remaining.
5 minutes? Wow. We have seen not only crime impacting citizens, but the scourge of crime hurting businesses. People being held up in broad daylight. People being murdered in their stores. More than 600 persons murdered last year, and on track to surpass that this year. And this comes at great cost to businesses in this country. The cost of doing business has skyrocketed, where businessmen have to pay thousands of dollars for surveillance equipment, hundreds of thousands for security guards and money movers, and they're still being robbed and have to pay thousands in insurance. That is the reality we see every day in the media and in some cases in real life. So, Mr. President, that is why we say There can be no prosperity in business without safety and security. Mr. Vice President, I turn quickly to tourism. This government's failure to diversify the economy is not only in manufacturing, but it is in tourism. This government has huffed and puffed about tourism. But when we look at the numbers, tourist arrivals in Trinidad and Tobago in 2015 under the People's Partnership stood at 442,000. And in 2022, it fell under this PNM government, 227,000. That is a decline of 48%. In 2015, according to the CSO, arrivals in Tobago stood at 22,567. And in 2022, under this PNM government, it has fallen to 11,844. That is a 53% PNM decline. And then the government chooses to ignore these declines and is elected to spend $1.2 billion of your taxpayers' money on an airport expansion in Tobago. The people of Tobago deserve development, but they also deserve a government that has a plan and has vision, Mr. Vice President. We heard nothing of a plan for tourism. Mr. Vice President, no arrival targets. Yet you are spending $1.2 billion on our airport. No news about deals with airlines like Copa and KLM that they did last year, but they're spending $1.2 billion on a wing in there. Even in room stock, they come and regurgitate the same two hotels. They don't even have the room stock, Mr. Vice President, to facilitate a drastic increase in tourism. Yet they're spending $1.2 billion on a wing. Mr. Vice President, the country of Antigua and Barbuda, a country without oil and gas wealth like us, which tourism represents 62% of their GDP, before COVID brought in 700,000 tourists via cruise ship and almost 400,000 via airlift. Mr. Vice President, because they have a government and a prime minister who cares about tourism. And they spent some 600 million TT dollars on a state-of-the-art international airport in Antigua. Yet we see $1.2 billion being spent on a wing. Mr. Vice President, and that's why we say, when we look at the situation of crime in this country, and I heard Senator Remy speak about our country going on advisories from countries telling their citizens not to visit us, and we wonder why tourism has declined. Mr. President and Vice President, that's why we say there can be no prosperity in tourism without safety and security. And Mr. Vice President, I don't have much time left, but point blank, in agriculture, another failure by this government. GDP declined from 2.61 billion under the UNC. After they screamed about the sector diversification, it dropped to 1.83 billion, Mr. Vice President. That, Mr. Vice President, I listened to the Honorable Minister in the state in agriculture speak about 30,000 farmers had asked them to thank him. Well, I want to say their GDP agriculture declined by 30%. So sarcastically, I would like to thank you for declining agriculture, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, again, I don't have much time, so I will say in closing, the PNM, after years with the same promises that never materialize, all three industries of diversification have declined, as I showed you. The government has no vision, no mission, and no plan, and it is clear that the citizens of this country can take no more. But, Mr. Vice President, there is hope. The United National Congress is coming in 22 months. In 22 months, our industries will see hope. In 22 months, our economy will begin the real turnaround. In 22 months, the people of this nation will finally begin to feel safe again. And just as the people in Sandy Grande and San Fernando did to them in the locals, just as the people of Tobago did to them in the THA elections, in 22 months, this government will be cast into the political cemetery where the United National Congress, led by Kamala Prasad Bisesa, will start to rescue the jobs of this nation and rescue our economy. Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance said in his closing in the other place that we are going to get diarrhea. That is unparliamentary, Mr. President. I will bring it to parliamentary conversation. What we heard in this budget was something called emesis and gastroenteritis, which is vomiting and diarrhea. Mr. Vice President, there can be no prosperity in TNT without safety and security. And I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator